Have you ever thought about listening to the other side of the conflict and not just to what the media is trying to feed you? The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine is a book written by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, first published in 2006. It offers a critical perspective on the events surrounding the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, focusing on the displacement of a large portion of the Palestinian Arab population during the Arab-Israeli conflict. Pappé argues that what took place during this period was a deliberate campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people carried out by Zionist forces to establish a Jewish majority in the newly formed state. He claims that the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and villages was not a result of the chaos of war, but a planned and systematic effort. Preface. Pappé introduces readers to the setting where the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was conceived, a building called the Red House in Tel Aviv. Originally built to house workers' movements, it later became the headquarters of the Haganah, a Zionist militia. On March 10, 1948, a group of Zionist leaders and military officers gathered in this house to finalize Plan D, a systematic and well-organized strategy to expel Palestinians from their homes and villages. This plan was not an incidental outcome of war, but a deliberate operation aimed at creating an ethnically homogeneous Jewish state. The plan detailed various tactics, including laying siege to villages, bombarding population centers, setting homes on fire, and planting mines to prevent Palestinians from returning. Pappé emphasizes that the goal was clear: the Palestinians had to be removed. Over the next 6 months, this strategy resulted in the displacement of around 800,000 Palestinians, the destruction of 531 villages, and the emptying of numerous urban neighborhoods. Pappé argues that these actions amounted to ethnic cleansing, a crime against humanity, despite the international community's increased awareness of crimes after the Holocaust. The Palestinian tragedy has been largely erased from global memory. Pappé contends that the dispossession of Palestinians in 1948 has been systematically denied, both historically and morally, by the Israeli state and its supporters. The preface also touches on the challenges of memory and historiography. Pappé notes that although Palestinian historians like Walid Khalidi have worked to document the events of 1948, their efforts have often been overshadowed by dominant narratives. Israeli historians, such as Benny Morris, have confirmed many expulsions, but have downplayed the scale and premeditated nature of the events. Pappé criticizes Morris and other Israeli historians for failing to acknowledge the systematic planning behind the ethnic cleansing, relying instead on Israeli military reports that gloss over atrocities such as the poisoning of water supplies and numerous massacres. One of Pappé's key arguments is that understanding the events of 1948 requires a paradigm shift, from viewing it as a war to recognizing it as ethnic cleansing. He believes that this reframing is essential not only for historical accuracy, but also for confronting the political and moral consequences of the crime. For Pappé, the denial of ethnic cleansing is not just a failure of historical memory, but an ongoing injustice that hinders any possibility of reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. The preface concludes by calling for a re-examination of 1948 through the lens of ethnic cleansing, suggesting that this approach may offer a clearer understanding of the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Pappé makes it clear that his work is not just about setting the historical record straight. It is also a moral endeavor aimed at fostering peace and reconciliation in a deeply divided land. Through his storytelling, Pappé humanizes both the perpetrators and the victims of this tragedy, urging readers to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. He acknowledges his own connection to the society responsible for these actions, and emphasizes that facing these truths is the first step toward creating a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians. Chapter 1. An Alleged Ethnic Cleansing. Chapter 1 begins by exploring the concept of ethnic cleansing and its relevance to the events of 1948 in Palestine. Pappé challenges the term alleged and argues for the clear identification of the events in Palestine as ethnic cleansing, according to international legal standards and historical parallels. The chapter opens with a definition of ethnic cleansing, described as the systematic elimination of a particular ethnic group through various means, including violence and military operations. Pappé emphasizes that ethnic cleansing is recognized today as a crime against humanity, punishable by international law. This conceptual framework, though commonly associated with the events in former Yugoslavia, has roots in historical instances of dispossession and colonization, extending back to biblical times and culminating in the colonial era. Pappé draws attention to how the expulsion of Palestinians fits well within this definition, aligning with tactics historically described in ethnic cleansing operations. He details that in 1948, the Zionist leadership implemented Plan D or Plan Dalit, which outlined methods like sieges, bombardments, mass expulsions, and systematic demolitions of villages. These actions were not incidental byproducts of conflict, but were part of a master plan aimed at creating a homogeneous state. The chapter connects this understanding to various definitions offered by scholars such as Drazen Petrovic and institutions like the United Nations. The consensus among these sources, Pappé notes, is that ethnic cleansing involves the deliberate removal of an ethnic group and often includes measures like massacres to expedite the process. Massacres in this context are seen as accelerators rather than the primary intent, underscoring how this approach was used in Palestine in 1948. Pappé also contrasts academic and popular definitions, citing how even accessible sources like Wikipedia classify ethnic cleansing as a deliberate expulsion based on ethnic or religious discrimination. However, he argues that while some sources mention the Nakba of 1948, there remains a lack of clarity or consensus in labeling it as ethnic cleansing, especially when compared to other well-acknowledged instances like the Holocaust or events in Yugoslavia. This hesitation often stems from the absence of legal accountability, as perpetrators of other historical crimes have faced international tribunals, while those responsible for the Nakba were never brought to justice. A significant point Pappé addresses is the legal recognition of ethnic cleansing as a crime under international treaties. The absence of legal actions or indictments related to 1948, he argues, should not diminish its recognition as a crime. He introduces the notion of the perpetrators, specific individuals, including key Zionist leaders like David Ben-Gurion and military figures, who devised and executed the plans for ethnic cleansing. These figures, regarded as heroes in Israeli history, also bear responsibility for the dispossession of Palestinians. Pappé suggests that acknowledging this duality is crucial to understanding the roots of the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Pappé delves into the execution of Plan D, detailing how regional commanders like Yigal Yadin, Moshe Dayan, and others led operations to cleanse various areas of Palestine. Intelligence officers under the leadership of Issar Harel played a decisive role, determining the fate of occupied villages and supervising atrocities. The machinery of ethnic cleansing, Pappé argues, operated like a relentless force driven by its own momentum, leaving politicians detached from the bloodshed on the ground. The chapter concludes by emphasizing the historical and moral imperatives of confronting what happened in 1948. Pappé argues that, from a legal and historical perspective, the events in Palestine fit the definition of ethnic cleansing, even if the perpetrators were never held accountable. He raises the idea of a rule of obsolescence, but notes that any true reconciliation must involve the right of return for Palestinian refugees, as envisioned in the United Nations Resolution 194. Through this chapter, Pappé aims to reconstruct and reframe the events of 1948 as a clear case of ethnic cleansing. By focusing on the systematic planning and execution of these actions, he invites readers to recognize the profound impact on the indigenous population and urges them to confront the historical denial that has persisted for decades. Chapter 2. The Drive for an Exclusively Jewish State, Chapter 2, explores the ideological and historical motivations behind the Zionist project in Palestine. Ilan Pappé delves into the origins of Zionism, the colonial aspects of the movement, and how these intertwined with political developments to lay the groundwork for the eventual displacement of Palestinians. The narrative begins by situating Zionism as a movement that emerged in the late 19th century, amidst growing pressures on Jews in Eastern Europe to either assimilate or face persecution. This national revival movement, originally focusing on Palestine as a religious symbol, transformed into a political agenda. Under Theodor Herzl's leadership, and later, more decisively after his death, Palestine was reimagined as the heart of a new Jewish nationalist identity. According to Pappé, this vision involved reclaiming what Zionist leaders perceived as a land occupied by strangers, all non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine, who were considered obstacles to be removed. Initially, Zionist settlements were small and unthreatening to the local population. By 1918, Zionist settlers comprised only 5% of Palestine's inhabitants. However, some Palestinian leaders began to perceive the movement as an existential threat. They unsuccessfully lobbied the Ottoman Empire to restrict Jewish immigration. Pappé explains that Zionist aspirations remained vague until British colonial rule in 1918 provided new political opportunities and backing for Jewish statehood in Palestine. The British played a crucial role in advancing Zionist goals. Lord Balfour's declaration in 1917 promised a national home for the Jews, but it also pledged to protect the rights of the local non-Jewish population. However, this promise created an inherent contradiction that led to ongoing tensions and conflict. By the 1920s, it was clear that the growing Jewish immigration and land acquisition posed a severe threat to Palestinian aspirations for nationhood. Pappé highlights how Zionist leaders gradually articulated their vision more openly within their internal circles. Their goal was an exclusively Jewish state, not merely a shared homeland. As Zionist leaders increasingly aimed for exclusivity, Pappé argues that the foundations were laid for ethnic cleansing, driven by a vision of a homogeneous state. The narrative draws a line from these early ideological leanings to the practical steps taken towards securing land and establishing a military presence. The chapter also addresses the military preparations that accompanied Zionist expansion. The British allowed Zionist settlers to form paramilitary organizations like the Haganah, which received training from British officers. One particularly influential figure was Orde Wingate, who encouraged aggressive military tactics and paramilitary practices against local Palestinians. Pappé suggests that this military training, alongside detailed mapping and surveillance of Palestinian villages, created an infrastructure that could later facilitate expulsion. During the Arab Revolt of 1936, the Haganah gained valuable combat experience. Under Wingate's guidance, the Haganah carried out retaliatory operations against Palestinian villages, setting a precedent for future military actions. Pappé points to the creation of detailed village files, which recorded crucial information about every Palestinian village, including topography, political affiliations, and resistance activity. These files, he argues, were later used to plan and execute systematic expulsions. A pivotal moment came in 1942, when David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist movement, articulated the aim of establishing a Jewish state over the entirety of Palestine. Ben-Gurion's ambitions evolved in response to political opportunities and constraints, as he prioritized consolidating a Jewish majority over maintaining democratic ideals. He believed in using force to achieve these aims but waited for the right moment, which ultimately came with the end of the British mandate. By the mid-1940s, the Zionist leadership recognized that their chief obstacle was not Palestinian resistance but British rule. They focused their strategies on pushing the British out of Palestine and prepared for the future establishment of a state. This preparation included a series of strategic military plans, Plans A, B, and C, that detailed punitive actions and offensive strategies. These plans set the stage for the more comprehensive Plan D, which Pappé later identifies as the blueprint for ethnic cleansing. The central takeaway from this chapter is that the ideological drive for an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine was deeply intertwined with nationalist, colonial, and militaristic motivations. The Zionist movement's leaders sought to achieve their vision not just through land acquisition or political negotiation, but through deliberate military preparations and planning. These plans, Pappé argues, culminated in the systematic expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. This chapter, therefore, lays the ideological and strategic foundations for what Pappé later characterizes as a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Chapter 3. Partition and Destruction, United Nations Resolution 181 and its Impact. Chapter 3 delves into the events leading up to and the immediate consequences of the United Nations decision to partition Palestine in 1947. This chapter explores the political maneuvers, implications, and reactions surrounding the infamous United Nations Resolution 181, which marked a turning point in Palestinian history. The chapter begins with the backdrop against which the United Nations addressed the fate of Palestine. The British government, unable to resolve the conflict between the growing Jewish population and the indigenous Palestinians, handed over the problem to the United Nations in 1947. At this time, Palestine was home to a mixed population of Jews and Palestinians. The Jewish community, bolstered by the influx of settlers and Holocaust survivors, still constituted a minority but was politically and militarily organized. The Palestinians, in contrast, remained the majority but were grappling with their leadership's disjointedness and political naivety. In this context, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine UNSCOP proposed partition as a solution. The committee's members were relatively inexperienced in conflict resolution and lacked a deep understanding of Palestinian history and the complexities of the situation. Nevertheless, they embraced partition as the guiding principle, envisioning two separate states coexisting within an economic union, with Jerusalem set aside as an international city. United Nations Resolution 181, passed on November 29, 1947, effectively endorsed this partition plan. According to Pappé, the resolution ignored crucial demographic and territorial realities. The proposed Jewish state would cover over half of Palestine despite Jews owning only a small fraction of the land. The Palestinians, who held most of the land and made up 2/3 of the population, were allocated less than half of the territory. The resolution was seen as an attempt to compensate Jews for the Holocaust, but in doing so, it failed to consider the rights of the indigenous Palestinians. For the Zionist leadership, the resolution was a diplomatic victory, granting international legitimacy to their vision of a Jewish state. However, their acceptance of the partition was strategic and conditional. David Ben-Gurion, who led the Jewish community's political decision-making, simultaneously accepted and undermined the United Nations partition plan. His leadership focused on securing as much land as possible for the Jewish state while minimizing the presence of Palestinians within it. Ben-Gurion's approach demonstrated a pragmatic and calculated use of diplomacy to further the Zionist cause. The Palestinians and the broader Arab world, on the other hand, rejected the partition plan outright. They viewed it as an unjust and immoral solution imposed upon them without their consent. The Palestinian leadership, recognizing the futility of negotiating under these conditions, boycotted the United Nations deliberations. The refusal to engage with UNSCOP, Pappé explains, is often used in Israeli propaganda to argue that the Palestinians bear responsibility for their fate. However, Palestinian historians have consistently highlighted the inherent injustices and biases in the partition process. The Arab League and the Palestinian leadership's rejection of the partition plan played directly into Ben-Gurion's hands. Their boycott allowed the Zionist leadership to shape the narrative and plan for the future without significant Palestinian input. Pappé notes that this pattern of sidelining Palestinians in diplomatic negotiations has persisted through subsequent peace processes, reflecting a legacy of exclusion and imbalance. The chapter then shifts focus to the immediate impact of the United Nations partition resolution. Rather than alleviating tensions, the resolution heightened them. News of the United Nations decision triggered widespread anxiety, particularly in mixed towns where the future remained uncertain. As anticipation of partition grew, law and order collapsed, paving the way for the eruption of the First Arab-Israeli War. This period marked the beginning of what Pappé describes as the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. One of the central arguments Pappé presents in this chapter is that the United Nations partition plan, while ostensibly aimed at creating two states, laid the groundwork for the systematic displacement of Palestinians. He argues that by drawing the partition map as they did, the United Nations members who supported the resolution contributed to the crime of ethnic cleansing that followed. The chapter implies that the international community, through its decision, inadvertently enabled Zionist ambitions and ignored the principles of justice and equity for the Palestinian majority. In essence, Chapter 3 highlights the political maneuvering, international biases, and strategic opportunism that shaped the partition of Palestine. Pappé suggests that the seeds of ethnic cleansing were sown within the flawed and unjust partition plan, which disregarded the indigenous population's rights and aspirations. As a result, the resolution triggered a chain of events that led to the displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people, altering the course of their history irrevocably. Chapter 4. Finalizing a Master Plan. In Chapter 4, Pappé explores the evolution of the Zionist leadership strategy towards the displacement of the Palestinian population. This chapter meticulously describes how a series of plans, political decisions, and military preparations coalesced into a comprehensive strategy for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, ultimately resulting in the forced removal of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. The chapter opens with a historical overview of the period between 1947 and early 1948. A critical window during which the British were preparing to withdraw from their mandate over Palestine. As the British announced their departure, the United Nations deliberated for 9 months and ultimately proposed a partition plan through Resolution 181. This plan suggested dividing Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states while making Jerusalem an international city. Although the Zionist leadership officially accepted the partition plan, they had other intentions. Palestinian leaders and the broader Arab world rejected the plan, proposing instead to keep Palestine as a single state. This rejection served as a convenient rationale for the Zionist leadership to initiate more aggressive measures. One of the critical moments that defined this period was the adoption of Plan D, Plan Dalet, on March 10, 1948. Pappé argues that Plan D was the culmination of years of planning and gradual shifts towards ethnic cleansing. The plan called for military operations aimed at securing key areas and laying the groundwork for an exclusively Jewish state. It included instructions for the occupation of villages, the expulsion of inhabitants, and, in cases of resistance, the destruction of homes and infrastructure to prevent the return of Palestinians. The chapter describes how the shift from sporadic retaliatory actions to systematic cleansing operations took place. Initially, attacks on Palestinian villages and neighborhoods were presented as retaliatory measures in response to Palestinian protests and acts of violence. However, by early 1948, the Zionist leadership began to see the opportunity to execute their vision more decisively. They used the Arab rejection of partition and isolated acts of Palestinian resistance as justifications for launching military operations that went far beyond mere retaliation. Pappé provides detailed accounts of key figures in the Zionist leadership, including David Ben-Gurion, who played a central role in finalizing the master plan. Ben-Gurion, along with his war cabinet, systematically mapped out which areas to occupy and which populations to displace. The Jewish agency, which Ben-Gurion led, was well aware of the military superiority they held over the fragmented Palestinian forces. With this advantage, they felt confident in executing their strategy. The military infrastructure of the Jewish community in Palestine was another significant focus of the chapter. Pappé explains how various military organizations, such as the Haganah and its commando unit, the Palmach, were trained and prepared for large-scale operations. Special intelligence units collected information on Palestinian villages, enabling targeted operations to expel villagers and prevent their return. This intelligence, combined with British military training, allowed Zionist forces to effectively carry out Plan D. The chapter also highlights how the Jewish leadership took advantage of the international and regional political landscape. Ben-Gurion and his colleagues skillfully navigated diplomatic challenges, such as negotiations with Transjordan's King Abdullah, which resulted in an informal agreement to divide Palestine. This agreement neutralized the threat from Transjordan's well-trained army, allowing the Zionist leadership to focus on their cleansing operations without fear of major military intervention from the strongest Arab force. One of the central takeaways from this chapter is the intentionality behind the ethnic cleansing campaign. Pappé argues that while the Zionist leadership portrayed their actions as necessary defensive measures, their actual goal was clear from the beginning: to establish a Jewish state with as few Palestinians as possible. He emphasizes that Ben-Gurion's leadership was characterized by his determination to seize the moment and exploit the disarray within the Palestinian political landscape and the broader Arab world. The planning, military preparations, and diplomatic maneuvers all converged towards achieving this goal. In conclusion, Chapter 4 of the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine paints a picture of a leadership that was driven by a clear ideological vision and backed by meticulous planning and military power. Pappé portrays the finalization of the master plan as a decisive and calculated step towards achieving the long-standing Zionist dream of a Jewish state. With the removal of Palestinians as an integral component of this vision. Through this storytelling style, the chapter brings to light the strategic and methodical nature of the ethnic cleansing that took place, challenging narratives that portray these events as merely chaotic or defensive responses to external threats. Chapter 5. The Blueprint for Ethnic Cleansing, Plan Dalet, Chapter 5, delves into the formulation and execution of Plan D, or Plan Dalet, as the pivotal framework for the systematic expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. Pappé describes how Plan D was not a spontaneous act of war, but a carefully designed strategy meant to establish a Jewish state through the removal of the Palestinian population. The chapter starts by contextualizing Plan D within the Zionist leadership's long-standing objective of creating a Jewish majority state in Palestine. It emphasizes how this plan provided a clear, comprehensive military framework that aimed to cleanse large portions of the land. According to Pappé, the plan was finalized in March 1948, with its detailed instructions empowering local commanders to capture Palestinian villages, evict their residents, and, if needed, demolish structures to prevent return. Pappé highlights that this was the first large-scale systematic plan explicitly targeting the indigenous population. The blueprint of Plan D, Pappé argues, shifted the course of events in 1948, from intermittent hostilities to a coordinated and premeditated campaign. The Jewish forces at this stage were well prepared and confident in their military superiority. They began executing the plan, following orders to occupy strategically significant areas and eliminate any resistance, thereby ensuring a smooth establishment of the State of Israel. One significant point raised is the dual narrative in Ben-Gurion's diary, where he simultaneously presented a public image of vulnerability to rally support while privately acknowledging the superior position of the Jewish forces. He played a dual game of instilling fear in the Jewish public with warnings of potential massacres, while being fully aware that the situation was tilted in favor of Zionist ambitions. His diaries reflect a clear awareness of the upcoming campaign and its consequences. Pappé goes into the specific operations under Plan D, highlighting Operation Nachshon, which was the first major military offensive executed under Plan D. It targeted the strategic route to Jerusalem, cutting off Palestinian villages that posed a threat to Jewish settlements. The tactics used, mass expulsions and demolitions, became a prototype for subsequent operations. Operation Nachshon not only secured the road to Jerusalem, but also set the precedent for other large-scale expulsions across Palestine. The chapter then recounts the massacre at Deir Yassin, a significant event that epitomized the brutal tactics employed under Plan D. Deir Yassin, a village that had previously established a non-aggression pact with the Jewish forces, was targeted despite its peaceful intentions. Jewish paramilitary groups, the Irgun and Stern Gang, carried out the massacre on April 9, 1948, killing and brutalizing many villagers. Pappé presents Deir Yassin as a deliberate act of terror meant to instill fear in other Palestinian villages, accelerating their departure. The chapter further examines the systematic nature of the campaign through detailed descriptions of how the Jewish forces executed Plan D across various regions. Pappé illustrates the precise coordination between military units, commanders, and intelligence officers, all working towards the shared goal of expelling the Palestinians. The plan's instructions emphasized that every village must be cleansed or destroyed, and decisions regarding the fate of each village were made based on consultations between local commanders and intelligence officers. As the execution of Plan D progressed, the expulsion of Palestinians and the demolition of their villages became routine. Pappé stresses that even villages with no direct involvement in military activities were targeted, reflecting the comprehensive scope of the plan. He portrays this as an intentional strategy to prevent the return of Palestinian refugees, who were perceived as a demographic threat to the nascent Jewish state. The chapter closes with reflections on the aftermath of these military operations. By May 1948, many Palestinian villages had been systematically depopulated and destroyed, their residents either killed or expelled. The landscape of Palestine was rapidly transformed, with entire communities uprooted and centuries-old villages erased from the map. Pappé argues that the execution of Plan D marked a decisive moment in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, laying the foundation for the ongoing struggle over land and identity. In conclusion, Chapter 5 of the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine presents Plan D as the central blueprint for the systematic expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. Through detailed accounts of military operations and strategic decisions, Pappé portrays this plan as a calculated effort to create a Jewish majority state by forcefully removing the indigenous population. This chapter emphasizes the deliberate nature of the ethnic cleansing and the long-lasting impact it had on the Palestinian people. Chapter 6. The Phony War and the Real War over Palestine, May 1948, Chapter 6, delves into the events and dynamics that unfolded around the declaration of the State of Israel and the entry of Arab armies into Palestine in May 1948. Ilan Pappé explores the duality of the conflict during this period, where the portrayal of an all-out Arab invasion masked the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinian villages. The chapter begins by contrasting the perception of a looming Arab threat with the reality on the ground. When the British Mandate ended on May 15, 1948, and Israel declared its independence, Jewish forces were well prepared and organized. The Zionist leadership had already carried out significant cleansing operations under Plan Dalet, targeting Palestinian villages and towns. The entry of Arab armies, which had been widely anticipated, was far less formidable than initially feared. King Abdullah of Jordan and his Arab Legion, the strongest of the Arab forces, had a tacit understanding with the Zionist leadership to occupy only specific areas like the West Bank. As a result, the much-feared invasion from the Arab world turned out to be a phony war in many respects. Pappé describes how Zionist leaders and commanders understood that the entry of the Arab armies would not derail their plans. They believed the Arab troops would be unable to mount an effective counteroffensive, allowing the Zionist forces to continue their operations. Ben-Gurion's strategy meetings in early May focused on the cleansing of Palestinian territories, with the underlying assumption that the Arab armies would pose minimal interference. This assessment turned out to be accurate, and the expulsion of Palestinians went ahead mostly unimpeded. A key aspect of the narrative focuses on the lack of coordination and effectiveness among the Arab armies. Despite the rhetoric from various Arab capitals, Pappé suggests that the leadership in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad was ill-prepared for a concerted military campaign. The Egyptian army, which had a large number of Muslim Brotherhood volunteers but lacked adequate training and resources, entered the conflict half-heartedly. Syrian and Iraqi troops were similarly under-equipped and struggled with supply lines. In contrast, Jewish forces were well-armed and organized, with the advantage of having received military training from the British intelligence support for targeted operations. Amidst this broader context, Pappé continues to highlight the focus of Zionist leadership on systematically cleansing key Palestinian areas. He describes how Plan Delay's operations continued in May 1948 with minimal disruption, despite the symbolic entry of Arab armies. Jewish brigades like the Alexandroni and Carmeli carried out the forced depopulation of entire villages, using tactics such as encircling villages, driving out residents, and demolishing homes to prevent return. Pappé refers to the orders given to the brigades, which included terms like tihor, Hebrew for cleansing or purifying, indicating the ideological and practical goal of removing Palestinian communities. One of the most chilling episodes detailed in this chapter is the massacre at Tantura, which occurred on May 22, 1948. Tantura, a large coastal village with around 1,500 inhabitants, was attacked at night by Jewish forces. Contrary to the typical practice of leaving an escape route open, the attackers fully encircled the village, resulting in the mass detention of its residents. Jewish soldiers separated the men from the women and children and executed many of the men on the beach. Pappé emphasizes that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of atrocities carried out to expedite the expulsion of Palestinians. Survivors of the massacre reported the systematic execution of men, driven by vengeance and often accompanied by brutal treatment. The chapter concludes with Pappé reflecting on the implications of the so-called phony war. He argues that while the presence of Arab armies was used in Israeli narratives to justify actions taken in self-defense, the reality was that the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians continued unabated. The influx of poorly coordinated and under-resourced Arab troops did little to challenge the Zionist forces' systematic campaign of displacement. By the end of May 1948, Pappé asserts that the ethnic cleansing operations had reached a point of self-sustaining momentum, requiring little further direction from the leadership. The key takeaway from Chapter 6 is the contrast between the perceived threat of an Arab invasion and the actual continuation of ethnic cleansing on the ground. Pappé challenges the Israeli foundational myth of Palestinian flight being voluntary and under Arab orders, suggesting instead that the expulsions were carried out deliberately and forcefully. This chapter emphasizes the dual nature of the conflict, a symbolic but largely ineffective, real war with Arab forces, and an ongoing systematic effort to cleanse Palestine of its indigenous population. Chapter 7. The escalation of the cleansing operations, June-September 1948, Chapter 7, explores the intensification of the expulsion and destruction efforts carried out by the newly established State of Israel. During this period, the cleansing operations that began earlier in the year reached their peak, with systematic efforts to eliminate the Palestinian presence and consolidate Jewish territorial control. The chapter begins by detailing how the escalation was both deliberate and strategic. By June 1948, the Zionist leadership, led by Ben-Gurion, had already seen the partial success of Plan Dalet, which targeted key Palestinian villages and towns. However, with reports of Palestinians attempting to return to their villages, the leadership moved decisively to prevent this at all costs. A meeting on June 1, 1948, led to renewed orders for the army to intensify efforts to stop any return of refugees, leading to more aggressive actions on the ground. One of the crucial elements emphasized by Pappé in this chapter is the shift in tactics. When dynamite and other explosives became scarce, Israeli forces turned to burning down houses and fields, displaying an increased ruthlessness. The army's intent was clear: to render the villages uninhabitable and erase any possibility of a Palestinian return. The chapter also discusses how the United Nations intervened with attempts at negotiating a truce, led by United Nations mediator Count Folke Bernadotte. Although a temporary truce was declared in June, the Israeli forces used this period to continue demolishing Palestinian villages. This widespread destruction, carried out while the truce was in effect, included major villages like Daliat al-Rawha and Sabarin, and highlighted Israel's intent to solidify its territorial gains. Despite Bernadotte's efforts, his recommendations, which included allowing the return of Palestinian refugees, were largely ignored. As military operations progressed, the Air Force played an increasing role in the cleansing efforts, conducting air raids on various villages. This new tactic of aerial bombardment not only caused widespread panic but also effectively hastened the displacement of Palestinian communities. One of the notable areas of focus in the chapter is the operation in Galilee. This region, which had initially been spared from earlier cleansing operations, became a new target in June. Villages in eastern and lower Galilee, such as Majd al-Krum and Miyar, experienced severe attacks. In some cases, like Majd al-Krum, internal disputes within the Israeli command led to partial reprieves, with only half of the village being expelled. However, such exceptions were rare. The chapter also provides a glimpse into the looting and appropriation of Palestinian property, which became institutionalized during this period. Ben-Gurion's diary entries revealed discussions with his ministers about confiscating Palestinian assets to prevent disputes among the Jewish population. The leadership's increasing focus on consolidating these newly acquired resources points to the broader socio-economic dimensions of the cleansing campaign. The brutality of the cleansing operations was met with sporadic resistance from local Palestinian fighters and Arab volunteers. However, the fragmented and poorly equipped resistance could not effectively counter the Israeli forces. The Arab League's army units, particularly the Jordanian Arab Legion, focused their efforts on securing territories like East Jerusalem, which created a divided front against the Israeli forces. Despite the challenges faced by the Palestinian resistance, the chapter highlights instances of courage, like that of Miyar, where villagers continued to fight against overwhelming odds. The Israeli troops, in response, resorted to summary executions and collective punishments to break any resistance quickly. By the end of September 1948, Pappé notes that the cleansing operations had achieved significant results, with vast regions of Palestine depopulated and numerous villages erased from the map. The systematic nature of the campaign was evident in the meticulous planning and execution of each operation. The Zionist forces by this time had taken over 78% of Palestine, exceeding the territory allotted to them by the United Nations partition plan. The key takeaway from this chapter is the strategic and calculated nature of the cleansing campaign. Pappé portrays the Israeli leadership as methodical in their approach, using both military force and political maneuvering to achieve their goal of creating a Jewish majority state. The escalation of operations between June and September 1948 marked a critical phase in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, cementing the demographic changes that would define the region for decades to come. Chapter 8. Completing the Job, October 1948, January 1949. Chapter 8. Explores the final phase of the systematic expulsion of Palestinians during the establishment of the State of Israel. Pappé illustrates how the Israeli leadership intensified their operations during this period, focusing on wiping out remaining resistance and consolidating their control over newly acquired territories. The chapter opens by describing the strategic challenges faced by Israeli forces in the northern region of the Galilee, which remained under the control of Palestinian volunteers and remnants of the Arab Liberation Army Allah. Despite resistance in some villages, Pappé notes that Israeli forces launched Operation Hiram in mid-October 1948. The operation targeted the Upper Galilee and even aimed to expand into southern Lebanon. The campaign included extensive bombardments and led to the swift capture of multiple villages. Leaflets were dropped urging villagers to surrender, but no promises of safety were given, causing many to resist rather than evacuate. Pappé recounts how these operations encountered localized Palestinian resistance for the first time, as some villagers, alongside Allied volunteers, attempted to turn their villages into strongholds. However, the resistance was largely symbolic and short-lived. Villages such as Deir al-Qasi and Ramesh fought valiantly, but were ultimately subdued due to the superior military power of Israeli forces. This resistance, Pappé suggests, marked one of the few instances where Palestinian fighters attempted to stand their ground against the odds. As the cleansing of the Galilee proceeded, the chapter reveals the inconsistencies in the Israeli army's treatment of villages. While some villages were destroyed or entirely depopulated, others were allowed to remain relatively intact. Pappé speculates on the reasons for this selective treatment, suggesting factors such as local commanders' decisions, strategic location, and in some cases, demographic composition. Like the large Druze population in some villages. This inconsistency, however, did not imply leniency, but instead reflected strategic considerations by Israeli forces. Pappé emphasizes that during this period, a shift in the term tihur, Hebrew for cleansing, took place. Initially referring to the expulsion and destruction of entire villages, it came to include more targeted operations, where certain populations were selectively imprisoned, expelled, or relocated. This strategy helped enforce Israel's anti-repatriation policy, aiming to prevent any possibility of displaced Palestinians returning to their homes. The chapter then transitions to the southern front, where Israeli forces pushed deeper into the Negev desert. This campaign aimed to clear the remaining Bedouin tribes from the region. Pappé describes how the operations in this area resulted in the expulsion of entire tribes to neighboring regions, such as the Gaza Strip and Jordan, consolidating Israeli control over the southern part of the country. In this final phase, the leadership focused on dismantling any remaining Palestinian presence that could pose a future threat. Key operations targeted villages in central Palestine, including those near Jerusalem and Hebron. The cleansing tactics varied from direct expulsions to strategic intimidation through aerial bombardments. The Israeli forces faced minimal resistance, as their military superiority and political resolve to complete the ethnic cleansing campaign had reached its peak. Pappé highlights that by the end of this phase, approximately 700,000 Palestinians had been turned into refugees. Most of their homes had been destroyed, and any remaining resistance had been effectively neutralized. The international community, despite witnessing these events, offered little more than symbolic gestures. The United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 194 in December 1948, calling for the unconditional return of Palestinian refugees to their homes. However, Israel's policy and deliberate destruction of villages rendered this resolution largely impractical. The conclusion of the chapter focuses on the long-term consequences of this phase of ethnic cleansing. Pappé underscores that by January 1949, Israel's political and military leaders had largely completed their campaign of expulsions. They effectively blocked any chance of Palestinian repatriation, sealing the fate of the refugees who had been scattered across Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and other regions. This outcome was facilitated by the deliberate acceleration of village demolitions and the establishment of new Jewish settlements on the ruins of Palestinian communities. In essence, Chapter 8 portrays the period from October 1948 to January 1949 as the culmination of a systematic campaign to reshape the demographic landscape of Palestine. Pappé's storytelling style emphasizes the methodical nature of these operations and the calculated decisions made by Israeli leaders to ensure the permanence of their new state. This phase of the Nakba marked the definitive transformation of Palestine, setting the stage for decades of displacement, conflict, and unresolved grievances. Chapter 9. Occupation and its ugly faces. In Chapter 9, Pappé explores the aftermath of the military campaigns of 1948. This chapter addresses how the Israeli occupation extended beyond military control to become a systematic effort of oppression, imprisonment, and economic exploitation directed at the Palestinian population who remained in the newly formed State of Israel. The chapter begins by examining the harsh realities of life for Palestinians after the completion of the ethnic cleansing operations. Although military campaigns had largely concluded, the occupation revealed its darker, more oppressive nature. Israeli authorities set up a series of prison camps across the country to contain those they deemed suspicious Arabs. These included men of military age, ranging from as young as 10 to those in their 50s. The process of detaining and categorizing individuals was arbitrary and often brutal, with prisoners held in makeshift camps before being transferred to larger, more formalized prisons. Pappé describes the dehumanizing conditions and practices in these camps, including physical abuse, lack of food, and severe beatings. Pappé also sheds light on how the occupation normalized the concept of imprisonment without trial. Thousands of Palestinians were held as prisoners of war or civilian detainees in camps such as Jalil and Atlit. Their conditions varied, but most faced a bleak routine of forced labor, meager rations, and ongoing intimidation. In some instances, entire families were uprooted and forced to stay in these camps indefinitely, with detainees serving as cheap labor to help strengthen the Israeli economy and military infrastructure. While detailing the systematic abuses, Pappé draws parallels to the detention of Albanians in Kosovo decades later. He suggests that the categorization of Palestinian men and boys as military threats, often without clear evidence, became a method of collective punishment. This approach to dealing with suspected Palestinians was justified through vague accusations and the broad suspicion that any remaining Arabs posed a danger to the state. Beyond the prisons, the occupation's impact on everyday life was also immense. Pappé describes how Palestinians faced restrictions on their movement, economic activity, and basic freedoms. For example, even those who were allowed to remain in their homes had to secure new Israeli-issued identity cards. Failure to possess these cards could lead to arrest and imprisonment. Furthermore, Israel's military rule over Palestinian territories imposed curfews, roadblocks, and arbitrary searches. Permits were needed to travel between towns or even to access essential services like medical care. One of the most tragic aspects of the occupation was the systematic looting and desecration of Palestinian property and holy sites. Pappé describes how Israeli forces, both officially and unofficially, engaged in widespread theft of Palestinian belongings. Sacred places like mosques and churches were not spared, with some turned into shops, military posts, or even bars. The seizure of religious sites served not only to humiliate the Palestinian community, but also to erase its cultural and religious heritage. The chapter also touches upon the ghettoization of Palestinian communities. In cities like Haifa, the remaining Palestinian residents were forced into overcrowded neighborhoods such as Wadi Nisnas. Pappé provides accounts of meetings between Palestinian leaders and Israeli military commanders, where attempts to resist these forced relocations were met with indifference and blunt military orders. This segregation of Palestinian neighborhoods and the restriction of their freedom of movement was an early attempt to limit the social and political integration of the Palestinian population. The narrative goes on to explore how this repression extended to economic exploitation. Palestinians were often forced to work in labor camps, performing back-breaking tasks under poor conditions. These labor camps were established to strengthen Israel's military infrastructure and economy, using detainees as unpaid or poorly paid labor. This exploitation of prisoners reveals the underlying economic motivations behind the occupation's brutality. In concluding this chapter, Pappé highlights the disparity between the treatment of Palestinians in Israeli camps and that of Israeli prisoners held by Arab forces. While Israeli prisoners were generally treated according to international conventions, the Palestinian detainees suffered ongoing abuses and indignities. This contrast underscores the broader theme of double standards and selective justice that Pappé argues permeated the occupation. Overall, Chapter 9 paints a grim picture of the early years of Israeli occupation. Pappé argues that while the military operations of 1948 were devastating, the ensuing occupation continued the process of ethnic cleansing in subtler yet equally damaging ways. Through imprisonment, exploitation, and the destruction of cultural heritage, the occupation aimed to cement the displacement and disempowerment of the Palestinian people. This chapter, therefore, serves as a sobering reminder of the long-term consequences of the 1948 war and the enduring scars it left on Palestinian society. Chapter 10. The Memoricide of the Nakba, Chapter 10, delves into the deliberate erasure of Palestinian memory and history by the State of Israel. Ilan Pappé introduces the concept of memoricide, which he defines as the systematic destruction of cultural and historical symbols to eliminate the memory of a people's existence. In this chapter, Pappé explores how the Nakba of 1948 was not just a physical act of ethnic cleansing, but also an ongoing effort to erase any evidence or memory of Palestinian life and heritage. Pappé begins by drawing a parallel with events in Bosnia, where nationalist extremists sought to wipe out physical evidence of the coexistence of different ethnic groups. He suggests that similar tactics were used in Palestine, as the new state systematically destroyed Palestinian villages, olive groves, and historical landmarks. This effort was not only about securing land, but also reshaping the narrative of history to justify the displacement and occupation of Palestinians. One of the key instruments in this effort was the Jewish National Fund, JNF. Pappé describes how the JNF, originally established to acquire land for Jewish settlement, became central to the Israeli government's project of renaming and reimagining the landscape. The JNF, alongside state agencies like the Israeli Land Authority, worked to replace the names of Palestinian villages with Hebrew ones, often based on biblical references. This renaming process, Pappé argues, was part of a broader mission to Hebraize the geography of Palestine and rewrite its history. Pappé illustrates how the Israeli state, with the help of archaeologists and biblical scholars, aimed to create a historical narrative that tied modern-day Israel to an ancient biblical past. This ideological mission involved more than just renaming. It also meant planting forests, constructing recreational parks, and establishing new Jewish settlements on the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages. The JNF played a pivotal role in this, creating national parks and planting European-style pine forests to conceal the remnants of Palestinian homes and fields. One striking example Pappé gives is the Jerusalem Forest, a large forest that was planted to cover the ruins of Palestinian villages such as Deir Yassin, Zuba, and Beit Omamais. These forests, described as Israel's green lungs, serve a dual purpose. They provide recreational spaces while simultaneously concealing the remains of Palestinian communities. The parks are dotted with informative signs and plaques, but these signs only tell the Zionist version of history, erasing any mention of the Palestinian villages that once stood there. The chapter also addresses how Israeli institutions and policies work to silence the memory of the Nakba. Pappé argues that this erasure is not only physical but also psychological and cultural. Through a combination of legal measures, educational policies, and public narratives, Israel has sought to suppress any acknowledgement of the Nakba and the rights of the Palestinian refugees. Pappé describes how the right of return, which the United Nations granted to Palestinian refugees in 1948, has been systematically denied by successive Israeli governments. This policy of denial, Pappé suggests, is rooted in a fear of acknowledging the historical injustices of the Nakba and the legal rights of Palestinians. Pappé highlights that, despite Israel's efforts to erase Palestinian history, some remnants remain stubbornly visible. He recounts stories of Palestinian refugees returning to the sites of their former villages and finding traces of their past, olive groves growing amidst the pine trees, or the ruins of a village well hidden within a JNF park. These traces, he suggests, are a testament to the enduring presence of the Palestinian people, even in the face of systematic erasure. In conclusion, Pappé argues that the denial of the Nakba and the ongoing erasure of Palestinian memory are not only morally wrong, but also politically short-sighted. He asserts that the right of return and acknowledgement of historical injustices are essential for any lasting peace in the region. The chapter closes by reflecting on the challenges of confronting these issues within Israeli society, where a combination of nationalist ideology and historical denial continues to shape public narratives. Chapter 10 presents a compelling case for understanding the Nakba not just as a historical event, but as an ongoing process of cultural and historical erasure. Through storytelling and historical analysis, Pappé challenges readers to confront the reality of memoricide and consider its implications for the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations. Chapter 11. Nakba Denial and the Peace Process. In Chapter 11, Ilan Pappé explores how the denial of the Nakba has shaped the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and stunted any genuine efforts toward resolving the conflict. The chapter traces the history of the peace process from the aftermath of the 1948 war through to more recent developments, arguing that the systematic exclusion of the Nakba from peace negotiations has perpetuated the injustices faced by Palestinians. The chapter opens with a reflection on United Nations Resolution 194, passed in December 1948, which called for the return of Palestinian refugees to their homes and compensation for their lost property. This resolution established the right of return as an international principle. However, Pappé points out that Israel's policy has always been to deny the return of Palestinian refugees, a stance that set the stage for decades of impasse and conflict. Pappé describes how early attempts at peace, such as the Lausanne Conference in 1949, centered around the call for the right of return and an equitable division of the land. However, the conference's failure was orchestrated by Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Jordan's King Abdullah, both of whom were more interested in partitioning Palestine between Israel and Jordan. This early failure, coupled with the Cold War's geopolitical shifts, led to the sidelining of the refugee issue and the right of return. One of the central arguments in the chapter is that since the 1967 war, the international community's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been rooted in what Pappé calls the 1967 framework. This perspective views the conflict as stemming primarily from the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, thereby ignoring the core issue of the Nakba and the mass displacement of Palestinians in 1948. By focusing solely on the territories occupied in 1967, the peace process has neglected the underlying injustice of the Palestinian dispossession. Pappé highlights that this framework has allowed Israel to maintain a narrative that portrays the conflict as one between two relatively equal parties disputing territory, rather than an ongoing colonial project in which one side is systematically displacing and oppressing the other. This narrative has been reinforced by international peace brokers, particularly the United States, which has repeatedly adopted Israel's terms as the basis for peace. The chapter further explores how Israel's so-called peace camp, which emerged after the 1967 war, played a crucial role in shaping the peace process. Although ostensibly more open to negotiations, this group shared the core assumption that the conflict began in 1967, thereby excluding the Nakba and the refugee issue from the discussion. Even well-known peace efforts like the Oslo Accords in 1993 avoided addressing 1948. Focusing instead on interim agreements regarding the West Bank and Gaza. Pappé argues that Israel's refusal to acknowledge the Nakba and the exclusion of the right of return from peace negotiations have resulted in a peace process that is fundamentally flawed. He asserts that without addressing the core injustice of 1948, any agreements reached would be superficial and unsustainable. The persistence of this denial, coupled with the continued occupation and settlement expansion, has deepened the despair and resentment among Palestinians, leading to repeated cycles of violence and failed negotiations. The The chapter also discusses the role of international actors in perpetuating this flawed peace process. Pappé describes how successive U.S. administrations, along with other Western powers, have supported Israel's narrative and sidelined Palestinian grievances. He points to initiatives like the Camp David Summit in 2000s and the Roadmap in 2003 as examples of peace efforts that ignored the Nakba, focusing solely on the territories occupied in 1967 and offering Palestinians a fragmented state. In conclusion, Pappé emphasizes that genuine peace cannot be achieved without addressing the injustices of 1948. He calls for a fundamental shift in the peace process, one that acknowledges Israel's responsibility for the Nakba and includes the right of return as a central component of negotiations. Pappé argues that as long as the Nakba remains unacknowledged, the peace process will continue to be an exercise in futility, failing to bring about justice and reconciliation for the Palestinian people. Chapter 11, therefore, presents a critical examination of how Nakba denial has shaped the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and hindered the possibility of a just resolution. Pappé's analysis challenges readers to reconsider the foundations of the peace process and to recognize the ongoing impact of the Nakba on the lives of Palestinians. Chapter 12. Fortress Israel. In Chapter 12, Pappé explores the evolution of Israel's geopolitical and social strategy after 1948, focusing on the country's development into what he calls a fortress state. He argues that Israel has transformed into an enclave driven by the ideology of separation, demographic control, and the consolidation of Jewish hegemony over the land. This final chapter examines how this transformation was rooted in the policies and ideologies that emerged from the ethnic cleansing of 1948, and how it manifests in contemporary Israeli politics and society. The chapter begins with an overview of Israeli policies towards Palestinians, both within Israel's borders and in the occupied territories. Pappé traces the origin of these policies back to early Zionist strategies aimed at maintaining a Jewish demographic majority. He quotes key figures such as David Ben-Gurion and Benjamin Netanyahu, who saw the presence of Palestinians as a demographic threat to the Jewish state. This demographic problem, as termed by Israeli leaders, was not a new concern, but an enduring one rooted in the foundational ideology of Zionism. Throughout the chapter, Pappé argues that Israel's strategy to preserve its Jewish majority has shifted from military conquests to more sophisticated political and social engineering tactics. One of the key points Pappé emphasizes is Israel's deliberate effort to prevent Palestinian families from growing or integrating into society. He describes how laws and policies have been enacted to prevent Palestinians from obtaining residency, marrying within Israel, or reclaiming lost property. These policies, he argues, are part of an ongoing strategy to maintain a clear demographic divide and reinforce Israel's status as an ethnically exclusive state. Pappé points to the construction of the separation wall, often referred to as the apartheid wall, as a physical manifestation of Israel's ideological fortress. The wall, stretching over hundreds of kilometers, effectively divides Palestinian communities and restricts their movement. It symbolizes not just physical separation, but a broader policy of containment and exclusion. Pappé suggests that the wall, alongside military checkpoints and settlements, enforces a rigid division of space and serves as a tool for territorial and demographic control. The narrative then explores Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, a move presented by Israel as a step towards peace, but described by Pappé as a strategic decision to freeze the peace process. He quotes Dov Weissglass, a key advisor to former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who openly stated that the disengagement was intended to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. This withdrawal, according to Pappé, reinforced Israel's grip on key areas while deflecting international pressure to negotiate a comprehensive peace settlement. Pappé also delves into the mindset behind this fortress ideology, comparing it to colonial and apartheid regimes. He draws parallels between Israel's policies and those of South Africa's apartheid state, highlighting the shared emphasis on separation, demographic control, and maintaining a racial or ethnic hegemony. This comparison underscores Pappé's argument that Israel's occupation and policies towards Palestinians are not just military in nature, but are driven by a deeper ideological commitment to exclusion and domination. The chapter highlights Israel's ongoing demographic anxieties, which have persisted despite efforts to expand Jewish settlement and consolidate control over Palestinian territories. Pappé notes that Israeli leaders continue to view the growing Palestinian population within and outside Israel's borders as a threat to the state's Jewish identity. This fear has led to increasingly extreme proposals, including the voluntary transfer of Palestinians to neighboring countries, reflecting the persistence of exclusionary policies. Towards the conclusion, Pappé raises a warning about the consequences of this fortress mentality. He argues that by focusing on building walls, both literal and metaphorical, Israel risks isolating itself not only from the Palestinian population, but also from the broader international community. This isolation, combined with the ongoing occupation and denial of Palestinian rights, contributes to a volatile situation that could escalate into further violence and conflict. In essence, Chapter 12 presents a critical examination of Israel's transformation into a fortress state, driven by the need to maintain Jewish demographic dominance and political control. Pappé suggests that this transformation is rooted in the ideology of Zionism, which seeks to exclude Palestinians from the land while consolidating Jewish power. He argues that this approach has not only perpetuated the conflict, but has also entrenched a deep divide between Israelis and Palestinians, making the prospects for peace increasingly distant. In closing, Pappé expresses concern for the future, warning that unless Israel fundamentally reevaluates its policies and acknowledges the injustices of the past, it will remain trapped in a cycle of exclusion and conflict. The vision of Fortress Israel, as presented by Pappé, is one of a state that prioritizes separation and security over coexistence and reconciliation, leaving little room for a just and lasting peace. This brings us to the end of this summary. If you liked it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening, and see you soon.